faith, doubt. Are they opposites? Is doubt the antithesis of faith? Is faith being sure, knowing for certain? Or is faith a perspective, a way to see the world and God and ourselves? Is faith exempt from questioning? Or is doubt somehow necessary for deeper faith? How many of you grew up going to church or with a clearly taught set of beyond question beliefs? That gets most of us. Hands down. Another question. If you only went to your own church and rarely, if ever, visited other denominations, and certainly not gatherings of other religious groups, raise your hand. You adventurous people in the congregation, that's great. One more. Did you believe, or did your church or your parents believe that your church really knew the way to God? Have you ever found out, you don't have to raise your hand on this one, have you ever found yourself blocking out other ideas or stifling your doubts about something that you think you're supposed to accept without question? Not having you raise your hand because it kind of gets serious here. We might, however, get a good chuckle, or perhaps give our therapists lots of money, working through the effects of religious arrogance, both our own and others. But actually confessing doubt, facing in our own hearts that we harbor uncertainty about crucial matters of faith and ethics, may still trouble us. If I doubt or question or even consider what may seem to be a heresy, does that mean that I don't actually have faith? That I'm not really a follower of Jesus? If I waver or hesitate or stray from conventional belief, is there something wrong with me? This morning, I invite us to take a look at the biblical character of Thomas. I also invite us to take a look at Jesus' response to Thomas's questioning. Perhaps then, Thomas and Jesus might affirm our own questioning minds and hearts. Sometimes our minds insist that we grapple with what we've been taught, with orthodoxy, with doctrine, with prevailing moral teaching, with biblical interpretation. What do we do? Where do we turn? In the UCC, we say that God is still speaking. That's right. Well, that's fine. But what if a voice of God, either through science or through another's holy witness, what if a voice that we clearly identify as profound says something that causes us to doubt something else, something we've always held true? What then? At Decatur UCC, we call ourselves a place of prayer. So far, so good. A place of questioning and hope. Really? Is questioning part of a faithful spiritual life? Like many of you, I believe that it is. And I'm happy to report kind of how I got there. I'm happy to report that in the relatively infertile soil of my own surety when I was a young adult, a few blessed men and women came into my life and helped me find the courage to question what once seemed unquestionable. Eric was a doctoral student in religion at Emory. He was also a member of the Baptist church where I was a member during my 20s. We sang in the choir together. Now, as a young adult, I had a vital and engaged faith. But as some of you know, because I've shared it before, my spiritual life when I was a child and a young adult was born of deep mystical experience rather than through theology or theological inquiry. So I had felt and encountered the Spirit and had just kind of gone along with the doctrine, with the teaching of the moderate Southern Baptist church in which I grew up. It had really never dawned on me to question. So when I heard whispers about in the Baptist church that suggested that some Christians didn't think that Jesus was born of a literal virgin, I was quite disturbed. And so I decided, with a bit of trepidation, to ask an expert, a doctoral student in religion. And so I approached Eric. I approached Eric with an agenda, though. I approached Eric seeking to have my burden lifted and my fears relieved. Instead, he gently and joyfully invited me to hold my sacred questions, to hold them in tension with orthodoxy by saying something like this. If God communicated directly with me and said that Jesus was born to a virgin, that would be okay. And if God communicated directly with me and said that this story was important and meant something, but it wasn't literally true, that wouldn't shake my faith either. Because my faith doesn't rest on the literal truth of that story. Whoa. Eric did not give me what I wanted. But he gave me something much better. He gave me permission to have questions, to have doubts that wouldn't break my faith, but would somehow make my faith stronger. Through Eric's sly little remark, he convinced me that God wanted my honest questions rather than just my numb, unquestioning assent. The capacity to hold doubt and faith simultaneously is necessary, I believe, for a life of discipleship. That is, a life of following Jesus. If all was certain, you see, it wouldn't be faith at all, would it? It would simply be knowledge. I clearly remember the feeling when I dared to speak those words that once seemed indicative of a wobbly faith. The words, I don't know. I was living in Minnesota, attending another Baptist church, and teaching college-age Sunday school. For some time, probably since that encounter with Eric about 4 years earlier, I had struggled with the difference between faith and knowing. I had always been taught to say that I knew the answers to biblical questions and questions of faith. And then one of my students asked me an ethical question that was based on biblical assumptions. Is it always wrong, Tim asked, when people have sex outside marriage? This was a long time ago. I gulped and thought about all the biblical definitions of marriage. I reviewed what I knew about culturally aligned morality in Christianity. And I looked him in the eye. And I said, Tim, I don't know that it is. I hope in that statement I gave Tim the same permission to question, to doubt, that Eric had given me years before. Several years later, I sat in a seminary class at Canberra as we began to consider the passages in Paul's epistles in which he may have begun one of the original wars on women. Modern Tea Party politics had nothing on the Apostle Paul. So I sat in class and held my breath as I expected the professor to explain it all away, to say something like, the Greek words change the meaning, proving that Paul wasn't really sexist after all. She giggles. I had a lot riding on this lecture. The reliability, as I saw it, the reliability of the Bible, the consistency of God's messages to us, and my own call. But Professor Bondi, like Eric years before, Professor Bondi let me down. She simply said that Paul was a product of his patriarchal culture, that he passed along the prevalent assumptions about the value, role, and intellect of women. Paul was wrong, she said, and his message contradicted the teaching of Jesus. End of story. She didn't assure us that the Bible was culture-proof or that every word was relevant to our current culture. More permission, even encouragement to question, to doubt, to be okay with ambiguity. I took a deep breath and experienced something totally unexpected. I felt my love of God expand. When we question deeply, when we listen carefully to the witness of others, when we engage both our heart and our mind, we come closer, you see, to the beauty and diverse truths of God. And so I love this one. I love this one who, through God's Spirit, can communicate hope, can challenge my assumptions, and can touch the world with love in such a variety of ways. In God's expansiveness, certainty. In God's expansiveness, certainty only serves to blind us to evidence that refuses, when we look into it clearly, refuses to pose as concrete, that can't be captured in flat formulas. Evidence of God's being that is somehow only available if we're willing to doubt, to question, to risk. Easter, my friends, asks us to consider the impossible, to consider the possibility of resurrection alongside with the God-established order of life and death. That's what it asks us to do. Easter asks us to consider life and resurrection and to ask about its meaning in multiple ways, to see through the lenses of both scrutiny and trust. On the second Sunday of Easter, we've heard Kathy read to us that familiar story of Thomas. The church knows him, the world knows him as Doubting Thomas. It's meant as a pejorative title. Doubt, of course, is often equated with unbelief, with lack of faith, with weakness. But doubt, I believe, is a totally normal human response to that which seems unrealistic or even too good to be true. Do you think that Thomas was the only disciple who doubted? I think not. Where do you suppose Thomas was when Jesus first appeared to the others? I imagine that he was away on a retreat somewhere, daring to do the deep and courageous work of soul searching. Maybe he asked questions like, who is Jesus anyway? Did he really live and die and live again? If he did, is it just a political strategy somehow? Or is God trying to show us something? Is this true? After his retreat, he could not be silent. He had to question. He had to confront Jesus and speak the truth of his own soul. So in Thomas's doubt is truth. Doubt, truth-telling, question-asking, deep seeking. Thomas, you see, risk the possibility that it was all a sham. He risked actually knowing because he asked the unaskable question. He risked his reputation by speaking his truth and seeking the truth. Thomas's relationship with Jesus was important enough for him to challenge the thing that would make or break the future of that relationship. How often we let things go unquestioned because we're unwilling, perhaps we think we're unable to speak the hard truth, to ask the risky questions. Perhaps we're afraid that we'll discover that what we've clung to so tenaciously isn't true, or isn't the whole truth, or isn't the only story. Let's look further. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this narrative is Jesus' response to doubting, truth-telling Thomas. Did Jesus look at him and say, I can't believe you. I can't believe you would challenge this. If you can't accept it, you're not much of a disciple. You should be ashamed of yourself, demanding to touch my wounds. That just shows how simple-minded and literal your faith is. Did Jesus say that? Rather, Jesus said, come here, Thomas. I know it's beyond anything any of us can imagine. So here, let me give you all I can to address your questions, to address your doubts, to build up your faith. Here, put your finger here. See my hands? Look. Reach out and touch. Put your hands in thy side. Utter compliance with Thomas's need to have his reasonable doubts addressed without any shame. Total willingness to give Thomas exactly what he needs so that his understanding can be stronger, so that his questions can be affirmed and addressed. Thomas the doubter wanted to see more clearly. He didn't want to be hoodwinked or lulled by the power of delusion. Doubts, questions, troubled his mind in the swirl of speculation about Jesus. And so he pushed back to clear his thoughts, to allow the questions to rise in him, to consider the possibilities and explore the alternatives honestly and with risk. And Jesus meets Thomas there, right there, in the questions, and gives Thomas what will bring him to life. If we, my friends, have questions and doubts, and the courage or perhaps even the desperation to speak them, Jesus shows us that love is there to hold us and sustain us and affirm us in our asking. Let Thomas be our prototype. Let Jesus be our permission giver, cheering us on in our questions, in our honesty, and yes, in our doubt. Don't hold back. You can see that Jesus won't be the least bit offended. Let's be real with God today, believing that in our honesty we will indeed know God better. We will let others see our humanity, our struggles, and like Eric, we'll give each other permission. And we'll experience, perhaps as never before, the expansiveness of God. May it be so. Amen. Religious groups Raise your hand. You adventurous people in the congregation, that's great. One more. Did you believe? Or did your church or your parents believe that your church really knew the way to God? Have you ever found, you don't have to raise your hand on this one, have you ever found yourself blocking out other ideas or stifling your doubts about something that you think you're supposed to accept without question? Not having you raise your hand because it kind of gets serious here. We might, however, get a good chuckle, or perhaps give our therapists lots of money, working through the effects of religious arrogance, both our own and others. But actually confessing doubt, facing in our own hearts that we harbor uncertainty about crucial matters of faith and ethics, may still trouble us. If I doubt or question or even consider what may seem to be a heresy, faith, doubt, are they opposites? Is doubt the antithesis of faith? Is faith being sure, knowing for certain? Or is faith a perspective, a way? Does that mean that I don't actually have faith? That I'm not really a follower of Jesus? If I waver or hesitate or stray from conventional belief, is there something wrong with me? This morning, I invite us to take a look at the biblical character of Thomas. I also invite us to take a look at Jesus' response to Thomas's questioning. Perhaps then, Thomas and Jesus might affirm our own to see the world and God and ourselves. Is faith exempt from questioning? Or is doubt somehow necessary for deeper faith? How many of you grew up going to church or with a clearly taught set of beyond question beliefs? Well, that gets most of us. Hands down. Another question. If you only went to your own church and rarely, if ever, visited other denominations, and certainly not gatherings of other religions,